A fading actress is given the opportunity to participate in a kind of experience involving a substance that has the ability to create a perfect version of you. But this will turn into a nightmare when the rules that should be followed for everything to go right are broken. This story begins by introducing us to a famous actress named Elizabeth Sparkle. Although we don't see what she looks like at first, we are shown that time has passed since she became famous, and we are shown a sequence where her star appears on the Walk of Fame, and as time goes by, it becomes damaged. In the present, Elizabeth is the star of an aerobics show on television, a show that we are given to understand has been on the air for many years. Once the recording of the episode is over, Elizabeth leaves the studio and heads for the ladies' room, but since the ladies' room was occupied, she says what the heck and enters the men's room. And look how conveniently, the producer of the channel enters the bathroom talking on the phone, and this is when Elizabeth can hear how the guy talks about her, saying that it is incredible that the old woman has endured for so long, and that the most important thing at that time is to replace her with someone younger and beautiful. The next day, the producer fires Elizabeth, and on the way home, distracted by some workers who were removing an advertisement where she was appearing, she has a car accident. Fortunately, Elizabeth comes out of that incident unharmed, but this is the moment where her life is going to change completely. After the doctor checks her, the nurse who was in the room approaches her to check her spine, whispering that she is fit for treatment, and proceeds to give her her coat and pretends that he did not say anything. Upon leaving the room, Elizabeth finds a USB flash drive in her pocket that says the substance on it, along with a phone number written on the back. At that moment, a former schoolmate named Fred appears in front of her, telling her that it is incredible that despite the years she is still as beautiful as ever. The guy gives his phone number to the actress in case she wants to go out someday, and out of kindness she ends up taking it. Once at home and driven by curiosity, Elizabeth places the USB in her television and finds a video that talks about the substance, a substance that is capable of creating another you, younger, more beautiful and perfect from you. The other you will be able to live for 7 days free and happy, but after those 7 days you will have to return to your original body, because you must remember the most important thing about this whole thing, that you are only one and you can't escape from that. Elizabeth thinks that all this is garbage, and that is why she throws the USB into the trash can. However, after a night where the age crisis hits her harder than ever, the woman decides to recover the USB and dials the number that appears on it, where a mysterious voice dictates an address where she must go to get her kit of the substance. The next day, as soon as she woke up, Elizabeth found out that the channel where she worked was already looking for a replacement for a new show just like hers, and one of the requirements is that the candidates must be between 18 and 30 years old, emphasizing that age and beauty is the most important thing in that business. By mail, the protagonist receives a card that says 503, and more determined than ever she rushes to the address she was given by phone, using the card that from now on will serve as her identification number. She enters the site, coming across a lot of cabinets that can only be opened using a specific card. Once at home, Elizabeth proceeds to open the box she found in the locker, discovering a whole kit that will be necessary for the creation of her other self. In the box, there are 4 elements that are worth analyzing. The first is the so-called activator that must be injected for the creation of the clone. The next is the stabilizer, then we have the blood transfusion hoses, and finally the food that will allow them to stay alive, plus a card that reminds you that they can only be activated once, that they must be stabilized every day and must change between bodies every 7 days without exception, because remember, you are only one. That night the long-awaited moment finally arrives. Elizabeth fills a syringe with the activator and proceeds to inject it. In just a few seconds, the process begins, and after a few seconds, the back of the woman opens as if it had a zipper, and from her interior emerges a younger and more beautiful version, and in effect, Elizabeth's consciousness was now in that new body. The younger version of Elizabeth proceeds to stitch up the back of the original, as well as attach a probe to the food bag, food that is perfectly rationed for 7 days. And last but not least, the new version of Elizabeth must be stabilized daily by drawing cerebrospinal fluid from the spine of her original version and then injecting it into her. After this, the new version of Elizabeth proceeds to enjoy her renewed body, and to prove her validity to herself, she goes straight to the casting for the new aerobics show, where she proceeds to present herself under the name Sue. As expected, Sue gets the part, and thanks to her beauty her fame goes through the roof in no time, appearing in advertising and making a life practically from scratch. So far, Sue has been quite clever and has kept a strategic control of the rules, feeding Elizabeth in a timely manner and using the stabilizer in the same way. The first week comes to an end, and although she doesn't feel like changing, Sue is forced to transfer her blood from the young body to the original body, and after a few moments Elizabeth wakes up. This is how Elizabeth's life begins, with these 7-day cycles, being the young version for a week, then going to replenish her substance kit and going back to being the original, and so on in cycles. Obviously, Elizabeth increasingly prefers to be in the young version than in her original body, reaching a point of doing nothing but waiting for the 7 days to pass to become Sue again. Since leaving her other self lying on the floor was already uncomfortable to watch, Sue decides to use her architectural skills that she learned from who knows where to create a hidden door in the bathroom, where she proceeds to put Elizabeth and then lock her in. The next day, the girl goes to the recording of her program, and at night she gets ready to go out partying like the young woman she now is. However, here we are allowed to see Sue's first moment of loss of control, and even though she realizes that it was the 7th day and that her hours before the body change were numbered, she decides to take a chance and go out partying anyway. After several hours, Sue returns home with a guy and begin to do it, but in the middle of it she begins to feel dizzy, so she is forced to go with Elizabeth and take an 8th dose of spinal fluid from her, something that should not happen. She manages to stabilize with this dose, but when she wakes up the next day, Elizabeth notices that one of her fingers has begun to deform. She dials the mysterious number to ask how she could reverse this incident, to which they proceed to respond that this cannot be reversed. What is used on in one side is lost on the other, for that reason the 7 days must be respected. After going to get another kit for another week, Elizabeth goes to a cafeteria to have a drink, this being the moment of another rare encounter. After an old man speaks to her behind her back and tells her that waiting 7 days is too long, Elizabeth concludes that this old man was none other than the nurse who gave her the USB in the beginning. Her theory is confirmed when the man's wallet falls to the floor along with his identification number. Trying to prove to herself that she still had some kind of value, Elizabeth contacts her former partner Fred to have dinner together, so she starts to dress up and prepares for the meeting. The bad thing about this is that when she was about to leave, the mirror seems to catch her attention, realizing that she is not really as beautiful as her younger version. Situation that leads her to a crisis that simply prevents her from going to her date, making her to isolate herself completely in her room. In what we could call a way to satisfy her anxiety and sadness, Elizabeth starts eating everything she had in the fridge, something that will have repercussions later when Sue takes control again, and it is that in the middle of recording the show a kind of lump seems to appear on one of Sue's legs, a moment that is captured by one of the cameras, and because of the embarrassment that the others would notice this, she chooses to go to her dressing room, where after putting her fingers in her belly button, she proceeds to take out a chicken leg, which in fact was part of the banquet that Elizabeth had given herself the night before. The next day Sue arrives at the studio as usual to record her show, but she is informed that it has been cancelled and that in fact the channel's producer was looking for her. Fearing the worst, Sue goes up to talk to him, but nothing could be further from the truth. The cancellation of the show had been because the public wanted to see the girl more and more, so in addition to giving her a more prominent show, she was also going to be the star of the New Year's Eve show. Well, this would be a moment of no return for Elizabeth, as Sue begins to take out dozens and dozens of vials of spinal fluid from her original body, and after several weeks in which Sue had not released control, once she is forced to return to her body, it is severely affected by the impact of not having respected the 7-day rule. Because as we well know, what one body takes in excess, the other will resent it. At this moment, Elizabeth's mind was already totally disoriented, reaching the point of hating her younger version even though it is herself, and in fact, if you think about it, the consciousness was the same in both parts, but let's say that, depending on which body Elizabeth was in was the way she was going to behave. After Sue regains control after a week, she notices that Elizabeth is increasingly losing her mind, so suspecting that the woman was going to do something crazy, Sue proceeds to extract liters and liters of spinal fluid, revealing some scenes after that Sue was in control for 3 months. 3 months in which she even got a boyfriend who even lives with her. But no, the dream life was about to end. This happens because Sue realizes that her spinal fluid reserves were empty, so when trying to get more out of Elizabeth, a dark liquid emerges from it, and when trying to call for help by the phone, they inform her that the only way for the spinal fluid to regenerate is to change bodies. At that moment, before it is too late, Sue has no choice but to change back to her original body, and when she regains consciousness and looks in the mirror, she discovers that she has practically become the witch from the original Snow White story, since she has aged too many years in one fell swoop. Elizabeth casts her boyfriend aside and, while also fearing for her life, decides to call the substance's number and ask for the procedure to end, not caring at all about her current appearance. This is how the next day the protagonist goes to those lockers and picks up the finishing kit, which consists of a syringe with a suspicious liquid, a liquid that she proceeds to inject directly into Sue's heart, finishing her off. But that doesn't happen, because halfway through the syringe, Elizabeth regrets it, and in an attempt to revive Sue, she proceeds to give her a blood transfusion, this being the moment where a miracle occurs. Both Sue and Elizabeth are awake at the same time, so both have an independent conscience. Far from this being a good thing, Sue takes advantage of this moment to beat Elizabeth up. In a scene so graphic that I can only describe it as hitting a piñata with a stick. Sue goes to the channel to prepare for the New Year's Eve show, which it should be noted was that same day. As expected, the girl fears that something will happen to her, since the original Elizabeth no longer exists, and as she was warned many times that the two were only one individual, something is not right. And it is, because in the middle of the costume fitting, misfortune begins to occur. Sue's teeth begin to fall out as leaves, and even one of her ears falls off, forcing her to return home to make a drastic decision, injecting herself with the little activator she had left to try to replicate herself, thus causing what can only be defined as a nightmare. And from inside, Sue emerges a monstrous creature which has Elizabeth's face where her back should be, and which has no defined shape. It has an arm there, an ear there, an eye there, etc. Totally out of its mind, and in an act of desperation, the creature proceeds to dress up and even sticks Elizabeth's face cut out of a magazine on it. The monster Elizasu rushes to the New Year's Eve show, and as expected, its presence terrifies those present, and it is precisely in this part where it is noted that the special effects had about 300 ml of red paint left, because after being decapitated, Elizasu does not stop dripping blood everywhere. In the final scene, we can see how Elizabeth's face manages to detach itself from the tremendous amorphous mass and crawl to its star on the Walk of Fame, where after embracing the last of her life, she proceeds to merge with the ground, leaving only a stain of what was the existence of someone who only wanted to be recognized again. The end.